What is your background? What qualifies you to write the 100-year marathon?
Well, usually people, give their Stanford University bachelor's degree and Columbia University PhD and learning Chinese for several years, and then working in the government for almost 40 years in different parts of our government, mainly the Defense Department and congressional committees.
Well, you're humble. You were the civilian equivalent of a 3-star general, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, I was head of policy planning in the Pentagon under President Reagan, and I had similar roles in policy planning later on under President George W. Bush. I was allowed by the government to declassify or use materials that are already declassified to try to tell the story of the last 40 years of U.S.-China cooperation. We've had an extraordinary effort to cooperate with China in a number of areas, one of which you're alluding to is the intelligence cooperation.
Your book is The 100-Year Marathon, China's secret strategy to replace the U.S. as the global superpower. What is the 100-Year Marathon?
Well, the 100-Year Marathon is a Chinese concept. There's a book that came out in 2010 using this term 100-Year Marathon, but it quoted earlier comments by Chairman Mao himself back in 1955. Then they were secret. That concept was China's greatest contribution to the human race, to all mankind, is to catch up and then surpass America. At that point, they were just 10% of our economy. So people thought there's no chance of that ever happening. But they grew and grew and grew, and they just passed us in December. They're now the world's largest economy, according to the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. But that isn't where the marathon stops. The idea of the marathon and the Chinese concept, we're at year 65 now. It started in 1949. There's 34 more years to go. So their economists estimate if things go well for them, by 2049 they will be at least triple the size of our economy. That's why I say in the book's title, they'll be replacing us as the superpower.
Their strategy is not military confrontation. Their strategy involves rather ancient Chinese wisdom.
Yes, that's right.
What is their
Well,
explain
I argue in the book, The 100-Year Marathon, that the worst mistake we could make is to see China as a Stalin or Hitler or somebody bent on military conquest. What they really want to do involves our cooperation. You know, the old Tom Sawyer story from Mark Twain about Tom Sawyer got other people to paint his fence for him. This is the Chinese concept. They need American investment. They need exports to go with very low tariffs to America. They need our science and technology. They need our goodwill. Our 2 million tourists a year, for example. They must not, in their secret strategy, they must not confront us or provoke us. This would be a violation of how they see their ancient history.
Induce complacency in the enemy.
Yes, this is a key part of the strategy. For example, when the American press a few months ago began to write that China is surpassing America's economy, the Chinese went out of their way to say this is not true. Don't worry your pretty little head about it. We're still very poor in terms of per capita. We're one of the poorest countries in the world. So anytime they have a major achievement, which might draw attention, such as their space program, which has made breakthroughs, really quite impressive breakthroughs, they will then pour mouth themselves, and they will not sort of be triumphalists about, look what China's doing. This is part of their strategy. There's other parts of it as well. What they call the national champions system is another important part.
Yeah, explain the national champion system.
Well, the national champions are the top 100 companies in China that the government helps. Sometimes they're government owned, sometimes they're not. But they're in strategic areas, and they want these companies to take over market share in the world. So often they will help the company, low-cost loans, even perhaps stolen technology that they obtain on behalf of the company, just anything they can do. And we've been calling them on this. We've been saying, you signed the World Trade Organization agreement. You're not supposed to treat your companies with favoritism compared to American companies inside China. So this is one of the sources of friction now we have with the Chinese.
You've said that China doesn't play by the rules, so that the World Trade Organization rules say you're not supposed to give favoritism to your state-owned enterprises, to your national champions, yet they do.
Because this is so important to China's 100-year strategy.
Clyde Prestowitz has said our fetish with rules-based systems is really irrelevant to the Chinese, and you've written that going forward what we can expect is that China will not play by the rules.
They give lip service to playing by the rules. That's part of the strategy. They don't want a direct confrontation. So no Chinese leader would ever say, we won't play by the rules. They will, what I would call, feign compliance and never directly criticize the system set up in 1945. They've written extensively about this, that until China is double or triple the American economy in terms of economic strength, it's not the right time for China to lay out its own vision of how the world's rules should operate. The model the Chinese say they're using, we learned this from Chinese defectors who came out and told us. We have a course at our Communist Party senior school. Our course is studying the American approach in the 1800s to get market share away from Germany and England and surpass the British peacefully. So it's very flattering to us that they're following this American model, although they have a certain twist to it, that the government helps much more than the American government did in the 1800s. Well, the American model, as the Chinese see it, isn't quite the same as what really happened. But their basic argument is the government helps companies. It brings small companies together and makes big companies that can compete in the global marketplace. China's been doing that. All their cell phone companies were put together to become the one big cell phone company, biggest in the world. Second part of the strategy is the government is supposed to pick areas where it can help increase the market share for the products. Third area is that it's kind of okay, it's kind of a wink to steal the technology of foreign companies and apply it in China, especially for the national champions. And this has gone pretty far. Some people say that it includes cyber espionage by the Chinese military to break into companies.
Does China believe in free trade?
Well, they say they do. That's the important point. To induce complacency in the West, they would never really challenge it openly. But in terms of practice, I think if you look at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce report recently, there's been a number of investigations in which the answer is clearly no. They don't, in practice, their companies do not go by free trade rules.
One of the other components and the principal elements of the warring state strategy is to win over opponents' advisors, win over advisors in the opponent's leadership circles. Can you talk about that?
Well, this is the way in the ancient warring states period. It's the way to bring down the old hegemon. You need to find out, in this case, Washington, D.C. You need to find out who is really complacent or pro the rising power, and make sure those people are strengthened, especially advisors around the president. In many warring states examples, they would have what amounts to a defector help them with the current king, and then they would try to isolate or otherwise demonize anybody who was a kind of a hawk and said, you know, this is a rising power, we need to be careful. This happened quite a few times in what's called the spring and autumn period. There were 5 hegemons that rose, and then each of the 5 fell. And the Chinese have examined this process, this several hundred-year process, for lessons on how do we sneak up and surpass a hegemon without being caught, as it were. And part of it is this idea that we need to find out who are our friends and enemies in Washington, D.C., and treat them very differently.
Well, yes, bringing it into the modern realm here of Washington, D.C., you've written that this rosy scenario, this narrative of a peaceful China, serves the self-interest of Westerners in academia, think tanks, financial institutions, government, and I would say media as well.
I myself admire their strategy. I'm proposing in the book, in the last chapter, that we need to do this sort of thing ourselves in China. We need to know who is pro-American, who is not, and be aware of how we treat different issues. We've not done that. We tend to treat China really as one big country and not parse out who's against us and who's with us. Their talent at doing this is really quite remarkable. That's what one of the defectors told us, who came out and described how they turned around Bill Clinton in 1993. So as you know, in 1993, President Clinton was quite anti-China. He'd run against President Bush, calling him someone who coddled the butchers of Beijing. And Nancy Pelosi took the lead in passing legislation to put stringent conditions on China before they could have most favored nation, lowered tariffs, trade with us. The law required all political prisoners must be released. China must move toward democratic elections. This panicked the Chinese, 1993, and they were able to help turn it around by identifying their friends and who would oppose this policy. They won. President Clinton, somewhat embarrassingly, totally reversed himself and went in for major agreements with China that dropped all the conditions Nancy Pelosi had worked so hard to get into law.
Who were some of those friends that the Chinese were able to influence?
Well, they identified people who believed in free trade. It's very simple. They didn't have to subvert them or compromise them somehow in a classic espionage sense. They just had to do some open source homework on who believes in free trade. And they identified about 5 people who are publicly known for what their writings. Larry Summers was one, Mr. Rubin, Bob Rubin was another, Laura Tyson, and they have made speeches ever since this 1993 turnaround. They're quite proud of their role. They believe that President Clinton had been sort of hoodwinked by Nancy Pelosi and the human rights people, and this was a short-sighted, short-term issue, and it shouldn't be pushed very far. It's okay to give rhetorical comments about human rights and democracy, but it's far more important to have the middle class rise up in China so that democracy will come automatically with the rise of the middle class. Unfortunately, we now know, 25 years later, that doesn't happen. They become wealthy, but the Communist Party is still there, and democracy and human rights, in many ways, is even worse.
And you cited the attempt in 1996 to actually funnel campaign contributions into the political process here in America.
What China is doing is legal, generally speaking. To fund a think tank or to set up these Confucius Institutes, there's now 350 in the U.S. They will offer a university several $1 million to teach Chinese language on the campus of the students who are there, which is quite a giveaway, really, and most universities signed up for it. That's why there are 350. But it's only later that some of the universities have been kicking out the Confucius Institutes because they found out that the curriculum, what you could study, even the nature of what Confucius wrote about is quite carefully tailored to show what a wonderful power China is today. It's not just Chinese language training. This is all quite legal, and our system is open to foreign powers who do this. The Republican Party, generally speaking, has been the party of free trade. Free trade sort of saves the world, causes peace, and brings about democracy. It's quite different from the Democratic Party that believes in human rights and democracy promotion to some degree, and wants to help companies and workers with, not losing our competitiveness, especially in manufacturing. So this tends to be a partisan difference, where China is quite aware that these Republican free traders are friends of China. They're given extraordinary access and praise by the Chinese. Anybody who visits Beijing and Shanghai can see not just 1 or 2, but dozens of McDonald's, Pizza Hut, and Kentucky Fried Chicken outlets. So this tends to make Americans think, wow, they're just like us. They must think the same way we do. And I wrote this book to try to show how China thinks differently about strategy over the long term than we pragmatic Americans do.